And with that, we are going to change gears. We are going to be introducing Matt Hatfield into the conversation today regarding the Paycheck Protection Program Flexibility Act of 2020. And Matt, I think you and I were teasing about this a little bit earlier, but I think we're on our fifth or sixth interim final rule that's come out since the PPP and CARES Act in general has come out.
Yeah, it's something along those lines. Some of them they're calling interim final rules, some of them they're not. I see 4 official final rules, but this one is not included in that. And one thing I'm going to give an update that you and I hadn't even talked about, that I just got wind that there's actually going to be more to the PPPFA in the coming weeks. So stay tuned, because there's going to be more.
So I should probably be retracting my statement that our next meeting is going to be in 2 weeks, and we'll probably, it's probably a high probability that we're going to have another town hall in 7 days. Is that fair?
It says in the coming weeks. So, weeks has an S on the end of it. But I do want to start off by saying, I don't have nearly the nifty charts and graphs and numbers that Brandon had in my presentation. And I want that to be known that is from the CPA, the accountant, that doesn't have the numbers in it. So hats off to Brandon for one-upping us in numbers. So.
Right. Well, I have to admit that that's partially my fault, because I'm the one that put together your slides and said, how about this? So with that, let's go into the next slide, sir.
Absolutely. So the PPPFA was signed into law by President Trump on June 5th. And I will tell you guys, this was lightning speed of this act. The House passed it. If you guys remember, we talked about this on our call last Monday, that on Friday before, the House had passed their version of it, and that Marco Rubio, Senator Rubio, had his own version of something along these lines that they were going to pass, and then they were going to go into the process where they basically merged the two together to come up with some final law to put on the president's desk. That didn't happen. What they actually did is they literally just picked up the House bill and they slammed it through and they passed it. And this caught a lot of people by surprise. I have another partner here who he stays very close in tune with the PPP as well, and he has some contacts that they have contacts in Washington and what have you. And all of his people were pointing to, in fact, on the day that this was passed, he was on a webinar with some people in Washington. They said, you know what, this isn't going to get picked up by the Senate anytime soon. It's probably going to be several weeks away. Well, then I got notified that night that this got passed by the Senate, and so he's like, this is crazy. Like literally, I was just told it's not going to happen. So this went really fast. Last week we talked, and I think I jumped on the phrase, instead of everything was firmly etched in sand, I said it was firmly etched in water. And that absolutely is the case as of last Monday. Let's say it's a little bit more like in sand, and maybe even a little bit, maybe wet mud at this point, because we do have some clarity. And Pete, guys, thanks for advancing that. The biggest, well, there's a lot of big changes, but this is a really, really big one, that instead of the 8 weeks to spend the money that you obtained under your PPP, and remember the requirements, you had to spend 75% of those funds on payroll related expenses in order to start qualifying for forgiveness. And so, or should I say, to qualify for full forgiveness. Well, that 8 weeks has now been extended to 24 weeks, up to 24 weeks, or to December 31st, depending on when your loan period was. So, but it's a 24-week covered period, which is really, really significant. And I'm waiting to see some of the paperwork and the forms that come out after this to see how they actually do the calculation. But that is a really, really big one. Pete, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, it's interesting they land on 24 weeks, because everything I was reading is that they were just, two irons in the sand facing each other and not budging from going to 16 or going to 24 weeks. And then, as you mentioned, how fast it came through, and they just stamped it on 24 weeks.
And that's
and
what was in the House bill. Yeah, the Senate bill had the 16
yeah,
weeks in it. Yep, exactly. So,
yeah. And it's interesting. So was it you that was on the town hall with McSally, where
yeah.
she was saying that they were more concerned about just passing something versus making it accurate or
It was
something to that
really,
effect?
yeah, it was really fascinating to be on this webinar. And it was with probably about 30 financial institutions here in Arizona. And she gave the background as to how the whole PPP, and really, I'll say the CARES Act, because, remember, PPP is under the CARES Act. They knew they had to act extremely fast to get money into the pockets of people, citizens, as well as to businesses. And they knew that if they moved fast, that they wouldn't get it exactly right. And so they opted, instead of moving a little bit more slowly and getting it a little bit more right, they decided to just start passing laws. And so they always knew that there was going to be further action needed. And that was well before the Flexibility Act, but they always knew, and that's why we've been seeing these interim final rules. We saw all the additional legislation start happening as this thing has gone on, and the additional CARES Acts. But I thought that was a really interesting comment, that they knew that they were passing something that was less than desirable because they knew it wasn't going to meet the ultimate needs. So.
Right, which means that we'll probably get some additional things in the future.
I think so. Now, I will say, everything that has happened since then has never been to the detriment of the borrowers or to businesses. It's only been more generous, which I think that's I think that it should be noted, because I don't think, and she even said this is not meant to be punitive towards businesses or people that are taking advantage of these loans. They're just trying to clarify it and making it a little bit easier to comply with. And so I don't think we're going to see anything that's going to be to the detriment of borrowers. Moving on, you say it expands. This is a big one, but not necessarily a huge one, because if you guys remember, 25 or 75% of the PPP loan needed to be supported by payroll and payroll related expenses. And that left the 25% for rent, mortgage, utilities, et cetera. What there was some discussion on is that that many businesses are heavy rent oriented and not as heavy on the labor piece, or maybe they have lower cost employees, like let's say in the food and beverage industry, where they have high rents but low cost of employees. And so this was an attempt to basically appease them in order to allow them to only have to cover 60% of their PPP loan in payroll-related expenses, and the other 40% can go up for rent, mortgage, etc. What this also does is it sets the bar low for people who maybe aren't in that situation. So the people who don't have a significant amount of rent or utilities, I think, are going to be just fine as well, because you have the 24 weeks now to spend it. And likewise, if there's to hit that 40% in rent and utilities, that's a pretty high bar for a lot of companies. So I think what you're going to see, I think there's going to be companies that they don't even deal with rent or utilities, and they're going to do all with their payroll and basically put it to bed that way. And then there's going to be these companies that are going to have to take advantage of this 60% clause, or should I say the 40% clause for their rent and utilities. This was kind of an unforeseen one. It wasn't on my radar. It wasn't on anyone else's radar, because I think we all thought that the 2 years was actually fairly generous. But they extend the loan terms for any unforgiven portions, which I believe at this time there's going to be very little unforgiven portion. But it's going to be repaid from, it was going to be 2 years with the first 6 months of no payments. So really an 18-month repayment period, starting 6 months into the loan period, but it moves it to 5 years at 1% interest. So very low interest and a longer period of time. So This one is still some questions to be asked, and I think we're going to see some significant clarification on this one. In essence, what it says is it removes the limits on loan forgiveness for small businesses that weren't able to rehire employees or hire them to the level that they were before. And I got some clarity on what that means. Is if they can't rehire employees because their business is a such business that they can't staff to the capacity that they were at the past, because maybe because of social distancing. What I'm thinking of is restaurants who have to now basically have lower capacity, so they don't need as many employees. They're not going to get penalized because of that. And so what my big question is, does this throw out completely the deduction or the reduction, if you will, in forgiveness for a drop in FTE? This also has some discussion points around not being able to rehire people because of the increase in unemployment, that people, some of these employees would say, I'd rather sit at home and collect more money from unemployment than go back to work for less money. And so there's, again, more questions to me on this particular portion of the Flexibility Act than any other portion, because I just don't know what happens with that FTE reduction.
Have you heard any chatter in your circles just about kind of the original purpose of the PPP was to allow employers to continue paying individuals even though they weren't working, because it was going to be, having them avoid going into the unemployment circles?
I haven't, yeah. And that's what's really interesting is it almost seems like it's a shift now to start appeasing businesses
Right.
away from what it originally was, is get money in employees' pockets. I mean, the original plan was, at least there was a push to do this, is use the outsourced payroll companies like ADP, Paychecks, what have you, and basically have the government fund employees directly and bypass the businesses altogether. And we'd never even be talking about this loan forgivability stuff. And to go from that to now we're starting to talk about, what's best for the businesses. It's an interesting point, but I have not heard anyone in my ranks. It didn't come up in the McSally call, but that's an interesting comment you make, because you're absolutely right. It's a shift. It's a definite shift.
It's definitely a shift.
Yep.
And then so these next two bullets are out of order, so I apologize for that. But I think you can recover pretty good.
Well, and yeah, and I need to make sure that we need to take that term tax credit. That is not a tax credit. What that bottom bullet point is saying is, if you guys remember, in fact, don't edit it right now, but I just want to make sure everyone knows that it's not a tax credit. There was a provision originally in the CARES Act that says you can either defer your employee portion of FICA, so employer portion of FICA, all the way through the end of the year, and then you would have to pay it in 2 equal installments at December of 21 and December of 22. That was the original CARES Act. Then there was, oh, thank you. You're actually going to do it. Oh, no, maybe not.
Yeah.
You tried. And then what they did is they decided, well, even if you get a PPP loan, what we're going to allow you to do is defer your employer portion of those taxes until such point that a determination is made on your loan forgiveness. And if your loan is forgiven, then you no longer can defer your payroll taxes, because you didn't want to be seen as double dipping. They didn't want that double dipping, because remember, you're using those employer portion of payroll taxes to calculate your loan forgiveness. Well, what this act does, it says you can have a PPP loan and you can defer your payroll taxes, your employer portion of payroll taxes. Mind you, you must remit your employee portion of payroll taxes. So make sure those come out of the employee paychecks. You absolutely have to send those. But the 7.65% can be deferred until the end of this year. And then you have 2 one-time payments to basically make those up. And thank you for crossing out credit.
Well, we are recording it, so I wanted to make sure that it was proper. So to repeat is that before this act, you did not have the ability of deferring your FICA taxes if you also accepted a PPP loan. However, now you have the ability of deferring your FICA taxes even though you accepted a PPP loan. That's a good summary?
The only thing I'm going to throw a caveat in there is with an interim rule, you had a PPP loan, you were able to defer up until the point that decision was made on loan forgiveness. And then once it was decided that you were forgiven, then you had to stop deferring. So in essence, there's an interim step. The way you stated it, that was the original CARES Act and the original intention. They just put that little interim in there. Now it doesn't matter if you forgiven, not forgiven, you can defer it. So
then there's another piece outside of this, which actually is a tax credit on payroll taxes.
Yeah, we talked about that a call a couple of weeks ago, the employee retention tax credit, and it's a maximum up to $10,000. And there was some, and it's off the top of my head, I just can't remember. There was some limitations as to what you can do in terms of if you have a PPP loan. But there is something called the employee retention tax credit. And you had to jump through a lot of hoops. It was by far more advantageous to go with a PPP loan.
Right. Okay. So that's probably where the credit came in my vocabulary when I was drafting this.
Yeah, no worries.
Thank you. That was good. Yep. Appreciate that.
And now you go right into one challenging one, right to the next one.
Both feet.
Yeah, exactly. And so there was that 6-month payment deferral that I mentioned, that it was a 2-year loan, but the first 6 months are deferred as to when you have to start making payments. And so it was really an 18-month loan, but you didn't start making payments until month 7. And then you paid month 7 through month 24 is basically when you would be making payments. That whole concept goes away. That is eliminated now. But what happens now is if you have certain amounts that are not forgiven, payments will start at the date that your lender gets reimbursed for the forgiven portion of your loan by the SBA. Okay, so in a nutshell, lenders are basically lent out this money from their own cash. They didn't get it from the SBA yet. They basically lent this out from their own cash. Then what happens is they own the note. So you sign the note and it says, I pay Bank of America. So B of A owns that paper, all right? Well, then B of A makes a decision on forgiveness and says, okay, out of a $100,000 loan, lender is forgiven $60,000. Borrower is forgiven $60,000, and $40,000 is converted into a note payable to the bank. Well, what happens is the B of A will go to the SBA and say, you owe me $60,000 because I'm going to get my $60,000 from you, but I'm going to get my $40,000 from the borrower. So it's at that point that the SBA funds the lender is when payments are made. Or all the way till the next clause is the borrower must apply for forgiveness within 10 months after the last day of the cover period. So if your cover period extends all the way to December 31st, which I think is kind of hard to get there because you have to have a very late PPP loan, you don't have to file for forgiveness until like October, all right? But if you don't file for forgiveness by the end of the 10 months after your covered period, then payments will start automatically. Pete, I know your head was spinning, I know, when we were talking about it earlier. So did I make it any better or did I make it worse?
No, I thought that was great. And I'm just going to remind everybody that Matt's phone number is going to be on the last slide of this presentation so that if anybody has any questions, I already need to talk through it. Yeah. His phone number and email, mind you.
Yes.
will be available. No, that was good. Thank you so much for kind of doing the review of the PPP Flexibility Act of 2020, and I'm guessing that there will be a few more sessions with Matt in the coming weeks based upon their interim final rules, or just obviously the FAQs that come out.
Yeah, well, let me read this last thing, Pete. It'll take 2 seconds just because I thought it was kind of funny, but it says, so this is literally on the summary of the PPPFA. It says some lawmakers have expressed an intent to seek further technical changes and clarifications to the PPPFA in the coming weeks. So further changes may be forthcoming. In any event, this is important here for everyone because these documents are out there. The SBA's recently issued loan forgiveness application form and the loan forgiveness interim final rules will need to be amended to account for the new deadlines and extended covered periods. So keep that in mind. We have already been told, we've been noticed that everything's going to change. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we will welcome you back next week. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.